presentation by our speaker, Dr. Robert Gates. Mr. Gates is a retired scientist and engineer from Dahlgren, very interested in local history here, been published in a number of different publications, including the Northern Neck Historical Society magazine in December. I was most interested in his article and think that he has a lot to bring to our meeting tonight. Rob, for your presentation. Yes.
Hear that, Bob? Claudette stated we ought to recommend everybody go on mute so there's no interruptions. We'll take questions afterwards.
I got this hooked up right. Good. As you can see from the title, this is a paper I presented at the Missouri Conference on History back in March. And I've been amazed 2 years in a row that they wanted a presentation on King George in Missouri. But I don't care. It's been nice. My wife and I have turned a 2-day conference into a 2-week road trip. That's always a good thing. This is the Potomac River is said to be 3.5 million years old. Other sources say it might be as old as 10 to 20 million years. Either way, it's an old river. It's also listed as the 4th largest river on the East Coast and the 21st largest in the country. Now, one thing I've discovered is that river length is not an exact science. If you go to different places, you get different lengths, you get different orders. So take that with a grain of salt, but that's ballpark anyway. And so the idea is that the river has played an important part in history and in the economy of the region, and it started with the native tribes.
Check and see if it's on.
There you go. It's the, again, like I said, you have to take it with a grain of salt.
I'm sorry?
I have to take it with a grain of salt, but it's the second longest river in the Chesapeake Bay estuary. Longest is the Susquehanna River. And it's it's said to be one of the longer rivers in Virginia. A lot of places say the James River is longer and the Potomac is second. Some people list the Roanoke River as first, but a lot of the Roanoke River is actually in North Carolina. So I'll say it's the second, but who knows? Now the bay was originally the Susquehanna River, and it was Susquehanna River Valley, and it was and before the bay was formed, it was tropical rainforest. And there were native villages along the river. And they moved every 10 or 15 years because they used up firewood and other resources. So they weren't permanent villages, but they moved every 10 or 15 years. Sometime between 8,000 BC and 1200 BC, a glacier melted and flooded the Susquehanna River Valley. And that became the Chesapeake Bay, as we know it. Now when that happened, a number of things happened. Obviously, the native villages relocated, and they they formed into tribes around that time as they built new villages. The other thing that happened is that the environment changed. It went from a tropical rainforest to hardwood forests like we have now. And also a lot of the large animals left. So what we had then is what we have now, deer and such things as that. So there was a lot of changes happening. Now, in the early days, in southeast Virginia, the tribes were grouped into what the English called the Powhatan Confederacy. They called it that after the paramount chief, who they called Powhatan, although Powhatan is more of a title than a name. The actual chief's name was Wahum-Sonnecut in Algonquin. I had to practice that for Missouri, although they wouldn't have known the difference. And the territory was properly called Sincamaca, which means densely inhabited land. And I assume their view of densely inhabited was quite different than ours. And so there were tribes, as you can see on that map, there were tribes all throughout that area that were more or less loosely affiliated with the Confederacy. Now, what happened is that the further away you were from the core, which was down here, the more loosely affiliated you were. The Eastern Shore tribes were the most loosely affiliated of all because communication and connection between them was really hard. But you came up this way to the Potomacs and others, they were also fairly loosely connected just because of the distance. Now, what happened is that villages grew up along all the major rivers, the James, the York, Rappahannock, and the Potomac. And the river, as that illustration shows, was a source of food. Crabs, oysters, fish, migratory birds. Now, the men also hunted and the women farmed, so food was available all year round, generally speaking. It was also a means of transportation and communication. It was a very important part of their life, of course. Now, interestingly, when the English came to Jamestown, Watman Sunnicut was not very concerned. He assumed they were another tribe who would join the Confederacy, which is, of course, not the way it worked out. Captain John Smith used the river for exploration, and he went up the river and mapped it in 1608. His notes in his diary are still in print. If you go look on Amazon, there are multiple copies of them still available. By the early 18th century, towns were being formed at the fall line of all the major rivers, and plantations were being built along the river. Now, the most direct route between the capitals of Maryland and Virginia was across the river here in King George. And so there was a ferry. That picture of the ferry is supposedly of the ferry at Ferry Farm, but it's much like what you would have seen the ferry on the Potomac between Morgantown and Barnesville. And it started running in 1720. Now, the ferries ran until they were interrupted by the Civil War, and then they picked up again. And they ran until the Potomac River Bridge opened in 1940. And they had been, once highways and cars had improved, and once that bridge was built, it was much easier and faster to go across the bridge than it was to wait for a ferry. And so you saw the ferry basically decline after the bridge was built. Now, the primary means of transportation for most of those years was steamships. And that was the primary means of transportation of passengers and goods. I remember talking to the former president of Rappahannock Community College, and she said, and her parents and grandparents lived in Northumberland. And she was saying that her grandmother's furniture mostly was from Baltimore. It was a lot easier to get furniture by water from Baltimore than from Richmond. And that was pretty typical from what people had told me. Now, so the first steamboat started running in 1829 and ran twice a week. The picture up in the top right-hand corner is the steamship Harry Randall. And that would have been typical. It started running in 1870. And that would have been a typical steamboat that you would have seen. Now, steamboats got affected as passenger vessels when the roads and the bridge were built. It was much easier to drive. It wasn't take an overnight steamship to go between Baltimore and Norfolk or Alexandria and Norfolk. And so, and then World War II really interrupted that as well. And the Navy took a number of steamships into the service. And you can see that a couple of them actually supported D-Day. And they had been steamships on the Potomac River. Now, what happened after World War II, there were still some steamships, such as the Mount Vernon at the bottom, and they ran through the 50s. But they were mostly day excursions to Colonial Beach and the amusement park in Marshall Hall, Maryland, and they did dinner cruises and things like that. Now, I picked the Mount Vernon picture because in March of 1956 they did a dinner moonlight cruise out of Alexandria, and the featured entertainment was a young singer named Elvis Presley. I just like throwing odd facts, and I had to have a picture, and that was a good one. Now, there was also activity on the river in time of war, and one of the first notable ones was the War of 1812. As you remember, the British came across Maryland to burn Washington, D.C. Well, Admiral Cochrane sent a small force under Commander Gordon up the Potomac, with the primary mission was to attack Washington. The secondary mission was to evacuate the army if they had to be evacuated. As it turned out, Commander Gordon sort of dilly-dallied going up the river. He stopped and attacked and landed troops at various creeks along the way, ran into low water at Fort Washington, Maryland. By the time he got to Alexandria, the city was burned and the army had left. So they stayed there for a couple of days talking about what to do, and they debated burning Georgetown. In the end, they just left. And they spent 2 days and came back down the river and joined Admiral Cochrane in the Chesapeake Bay. So it wasn't exciting, but that was the first notable thing I can find for use of the river. A more notable one was in the Civil War. Southern Maryland was a hotbed of smugglers and spies, and it was close to Washington, so the Union Army had soldiers stationed throughout Southern Maryland for the whole Civil War just to make sure they kept things under control. They also established the Potomac Flotilla, whose main job was to keep the river open for traffic and to take care of smugglers. The first commander of the Potomac Flotilla was Commander James Harmon Ward. Among the earliest naval battles in the Civil War were two on the Potomac River. There was one in May of 1861 at Aquia Creek, and a month later at Matthias Point. And the purpose of both of those battles was to eliminate Confederate batteries that were being built at those points that they thought would impede traffic on the river. As it turned out, they were both very inconclusive battles. Up at Aquia Creek, the Confederates within a month or so just left. So had nothing to do with being attacked, and there was nobody hurt or killed. The most notable thing is that at Matthias Point, James Ward was killed in the attack at Matthias Point, and he was the first Union Navy officer killed in the Civil War. And there's a historical marker down by Arby's Inn, right at the foot of a very nice bridge. Now the Navy had lots of other uses for the Potomac. Washington Navy Yard was built in 1799 on what was then known as the eastern branch of the Potomac River. These days it's better known as the Anacostia River, but at the time it was the eastern branch of the Potomac. When it was built in 1799, it was the largest Navy shipbuilding facility. It's also the oldest Navy base. And a few years later, in 1847, Lieutenant John Dahlgren was assigned to the Navy Yard, and he established the experimental test battery. And their purpose was to develop, test, and accept naval guns by firing them into the river. Now, after a few years, the range of the guns they were testing were longer than the range on the river, and supposedly they hit Northern Virginia a couple of times while they were testing. There was also traffic on the river, which made scheduling tricky. So they decided they had to move it, and in 1872, they did that, and they created the Naval Proving Ground on the Severn River across the river from the Naval Academy. And there was a nice range down the Severn River. There was a lighthouse at one point, but if you're careful, it didn't come into play. But it was a nice long range. There was still traffic on the Severn, so there was some issues with scheduling. But the main problem was most of the test articles were coming from the Washington Navy Yard. And the weight of the guns and things, plus the general crappiness of the roads, said the only way to get it there was by water. So they had to bring it down the Potomac, up the bay, and up the Severn. And that got old. And so they started looking for a place that they described as being close to Washington but remote. And in 1890, that was Indian Head, Maryland. So they moved the Naval Proving Grounds to Indian Head in 1890. And it really was remote. There was no workforce. They commuted by water on a weekly basis to come down to work. The farmers helped clear the land where the base is. So it was 25 miles from Washington, but really remote, almost impossible to reach. And then, but by 1910 or 1912, if you looked at the battleships that were before that time, the main battery was basically 12-inch guns. But after the dreadnoughts were being built, the main battery was now 14-inch guns. And later 16-inch guns. They exceeded the capability of the range of Indian Head. And so they did some special things to try to test them. And there were some accidents, but as early as 1912, they were looking for some place to test these guns, but they couldn't test at Indian Head. And by 1918, they came around Matthias Point and found where Dahlgren is now at Dido. And it's hard, you can't tell from that map, but there's a 90,000 yard range at Dahlgren, 50 miles from Dahlgren, basically down to the bay. Now the longest firing I've been able to find at Dahlgren is about 27 miles. And most of the testing is the upper 20 miles or less these days in particular. So while the range is 50 miles long, they've never used the capacity of the range. But it was created as an auxiliary test site. The Naval Proving Ground was still at Indian Head. Headquarters was still at Indian Head. Dahlgren was called the lower station of Indian Head. And it was an auxiliary range, and the purpose was it was going to be used when you needed a range of that length. But basically headquarters and all the building and most of the people were going to be in Maryland. Now, I've done a lot of research and written about that. If you read about and I read what Admiral Earl, the Chief of the Bureau of Ordnance, did. I don't think that was ever really his intent. He did some things that would lead you to believe that he intended to see the Naval Proving Ground move to Dahlgren. And it did. In 1932, Dahlgren became the Naval Proving Ground. And then they've been testing on the river ever since. I've gone back and looked at some of the records. There's some records that say during World War II, the peak of testing was during World War II, and they were averaging 640 or 650 shots per day during World War II. Obviously, Dahlgren was a level place. And that was also when the workforce, for many years, that's when the workforce was at its largest. Bigger now, but at the time, it was really grew during World War II. There was another peak during Vietnam, but that peak is a much lower peak than the one during World War II. Now, the Navy had the same issues with travel. How do you travel between Dahlgren and Indian Head in the Navy Yard? And the only practical way to do it was by the river. So the Navy bought 2 ferries. The USS Grampus, they bought that in December of 1917 from the Eastern Steamship Line. And it was used on the Potomac River until it was decommissioned in December of 1930. When it was decommissioned, it was sold and used by various companies to transport passengers. The records sort of end in 1981 without saying what became of it, but it was still active until 1981. And then it disappears from the official records. And the interesting part was it was also during the middle 50s, it was used by the Circle Statue of Liberty line in New York City for a couple of years. The other was the USS Porpoise, originally named the USS Moosehead. And the name is obviously was bought from the Maine Central Railroad Company, and they had probably named it Moosehead, but they changed the name to Porpoise when the Navy got it, and they bought that one, and it was commissioned in March of 1918. It was also decommissioned in December of 1930. It was sold and used by various companies to transport passengers. Eventually, the Army bought it, and the Army was using it. And in December of 1941, it was grounded and sunk off of Massachusetts.
Look.
Oh. Now, I mentioned the Potomac River Bridge earlier when it opened in 1940. It was the first bridge south of the Long Bridge, now known as Key Bridge, in Washington. And it was, when the argument was being made to build it, a lot of the argument was based on a national defense need. The only north-south route to speak of was Route 1. And they thought there was a need for an alternate north-south route besides Route 1. So that was part of the justification Maryland used to build the bridge. And now, I found it interesting that within 2 years, and there was a war on, the projections of traffic on the bridge had exceeded, the traffic on the bridge had exceeded the projections within 2 or 3 years during the war. That was kind of amazing. Now, what happened is that after the war continued to grow, and you remember driving through southern Maryland in the 60s, with the 50s and 60s with the slot machines and the restaurants and bars with Las Vegas names. Southern Maryland really benefited from the bridge being built and traffic being routed that way. Fredericksburg was opposed to the bridge because they saw a loss of tourism. But the other thing that happened besides, and when the bridge was built, it opened up it had a big effect on the economy in Virginia. It opened up tourism. Places like Stratford Hall made it more accessible. Gave you an alternate route to Williamsburg and Jamestown. So it had a big tourist benefit. But one of the more important benefits, this is what the Northern Neck politicians really pushed for, is it gave a new market for seafood and produce from the Northern Neck. So it had a huge impact on the economy of the region. Now, there was as the use of the bridge continued, there was a lull in the early 60s when the Capitol Beltway opened. But that lull was only temporary. And then it picked up and continued to grow. And long before this new bridge was built, it was clear that a new bridge was needed. And Maryland did a number of studies over a 20-year period before they finally got the money to do it. And so that's the new bridge opened in 2022. Now, and I started off by saying the bridge was an important part of the economy in the history of this region, and it still is. The national security need for the bridge is still somewhat true. The effect on the economy, like I said, has been huge. And we started the story with the natives. Native history is becoming much more important again as the number of tribes that receives federal and state recognition, and things like the Potomac site over in near Fredericksburg. A lot of native history is being focused on again. So that takes us right back to where we started, how this was an important economy. Started with the natives, back to the natives. So that's it. And I'll take any questions anybody has.
What were the projections for the bridge?
My paper was published. No one has got all that in it. It was a few 100,000, and it exceeded that pretty rapidly. And even the bridge website back 10 years ago had more than 1 million people a year going over the bridge, and I'm sure that's higher now. I live in Dogwood, I see that. I'm sure it's higher than that now.
Who paid for the bridge in 1940?
Maryland. I mean, the river belongs to Maryland. So Maryland has to build the bridge. Now, there's a lot of negotiation. I have a paper that's going to be published on the building of this bridge. It'll be published in the next Northern Neck Virginia Historical Society magazine. There was a lot of that Virginia had to do because there was no road that went to where the bridge was going to come to Virginia. So Virginia had to build roads. 301 stopped in basically Richmond. So they had to, well, they basically renamed Route 2 to be 2 and 301, but then they had to build the road from Bowling Green through Port Royal. And that was, and the road was there, went to Office Hall, and then went sort of where 206 is, where Dahlgren Road is, it went from there to the gate of Dahlgren, but there was no road that went to the bridge. And so they had to build a number of roads.
But these bridges only 84 years old, right?
It was built in 1940, opened in 1940. And so that while Maryland built the bridge, Virginia had a lot to do on the Virginia side with highways, so you had some place to go after you came across the bridge. And in fact, when they opened the bridge in December of 1940, the road on the Virginia side was still dirt. They hadn't finished the road yet. And then they ran into problems, but they built A.P. Hill in 1940, and they thought the Army might close 301 through the base. So they were looking that there was a big interruption going to happen on the north side of the road, but obviously they got negotiated away. So you can read all about that in my next paper.
The Powhatan Confederacy, I assume that was for mutual protection. So
It was mutual protection and economics, and Wahoo Sonnecut was what they called him the paramount chief. Each of the tribes had their own chief, and they were largely independent, but they were affiliated in some ways, depending on distance and some strength.
So there were incursions by like the Algonquins, the Iroquois, Choctaw, into these areas, so they decided they needed to have a federal confederation.
Yeah, well, and the Powhatan Confederacy, they were Algonquin, and Algonquin included the Iroquois, and there were Algonquin tribes further up on the Maryland side of the river. So Algonquin is a huge catch-all for this part of the country.
Question for you. In your opinion, did the establishment of the bridge in 1940, did that lead to the increased activity on the base, or vice versa?
Well, it was kind of funny because there was there was a hearing about building that bridge in Washington, and the then commander of Dahlgren testified against the bridge. He was concerned that the bridge would interfere with their testing on the river. And the Maryland people were concerned that when there was something going on, they would have to close the bridge temporarily. So there was a lot of concern about that, and they actually worked out the deal. Most of the testing from Dahlgren was south down the river from the bridge. There wasn't any guns being shot north. They were all going down the river.
What about plate battery? The presence of plate testing on the north side?
Well, there was like I said, there was some concern on the Maryland side that they might have to close the bridge under some circumstances. But after the base commander agreed they could probably accommodate the bridge, they did, and it never seemed to be a problem. Now, during World War II, there was a lot of concern in Maryland about sabotage of bridges and dams. So they had a Maryland guard of the Department of State Police that was stationed on the bridge to make sure that when the sabotage of the bridge, and it did all the major dams in Maryland, and it was basically disbanded early on because there wasn't anything going on. But I mean, it was treated like a very important national asset during the beginning of World War II, and a lot of transportation to the base came that way, as well as just people in general. But there's really, I mean, there was a lot of testing during the base grew during World War II, went down after World War II, went up a little bit during Korea, but Dahlgren was threatened with being closed right after Korea. Because naval guns weren't the big thing airplanes were. And so, but got through it, and then by the early 60s, there was warnings of the Dahlgren were going to be closed in the computer center at Dahlgren. And the computer capability of Dahlgren actually saved Dahlgren in the 60s. So and then after that, it really took off. But it took off after that because Dahlgren had managed to associate their projects with things that were of interest to the Navy. And that was the key. They were doing things the Navy wanted. Other places weren't, like White Oak in Maryland. They weren't as tightly tied to a Navy product as Dahlgren was. So Dahlgren established a link and a connection and a value that just continued to grow.
You know the Potomac is between Maryland and Virginia. Who gave it this river to Maryland?
Well, you can go back, there are a number of stories. There were big oyster wars in the 18th century. I mean, people being killed over places to ton oysters. And there was a negotiation at Mount Vernon, George Washington, that to help settle it. Now, there was, and there was an agreement reached later that the river belonged to Maryland. And that was actually there was actually a court case, and you can go and find the court case that ratified that agreement that says the river belongs to Maryland. And at one point, King George tried to make the argument to Caroline that the river had to belong to them, but Caroline didn't buy that. But it's interesting, if you look at the signs we Exchange County, if you're going south on 301 on the north side of the bridge, it says you're entering Caroline. Excuse me, on the south side of the bridge, it says you're entering Caroline County. If you're going north, there's a sign that says you're entering King George. That aren't opposite each other.
Well, the Potomac goes to West Virginia, don't they?
It was up that way.
Yeah.
I mean, if you go to Harper's Ferry, the Potomac, and the Shenandoah River all come together at Harper's Ferry. But it's, like I said, getting the length of a river is really difficult to decide where a river begins. Much easier if it ends at the bay than to say where it ends. But it's really hard to say where a river starts. So you get different numbers for how long it is.
With the testing that's going on, you have this litigious era that we're in. Are there lawsuits and things filed against
There's a current lawsuit against Dahlgren by an environmental group for contaminating the river.
But in the 70s, there were a lot of testing, more than is today.
Well, there's one in the courts right now.
Even Bayberry and there was everything.
But and I know when I was on staff at Dahlgren, there were a lot of complaints from Swan Point on the Maryland side.
And now you don't hear it much.
No, and I always found it interesting. Occasionally you see people who buy a house and then complain about the noise. And I'll apologize to Bob, the realtor, but I think realtors have made a habit of showing houses on weekends and not necessarily sharing what goes on during the week.
But also, as a disclaimer, our company does make people aware of that.
Yeah, and other places when people have moved in here, well, they haven't done their due diligence, and all of a sudden
People don't.
there's noise and they complain. It's like building a house at the end of the runway.
They don't make it too much noise. In the 70s, 80s,
Yeah. But I mean, I think the one that's in the courts right now may be one of the more serious ones. There is an environmental group in Dahlgren. Dahlgren doesn't fire live rams down the river, but they've fired a lot of rams since 1918 of metal. So there's a lot of metal in the river, and they're talking about some of the metal being hazardous. So that's going through the courts, and who knows what. I can't imagine they'll close Dahlgren because of it, but who knows what will happen.
My mother always told me that she could remember 301 as a dirt road.
Yeah.
How far south did the dirt come, the dirt road come?
Well, what happened is that 301 ran from South Carolina up to Petersburg. And then they extended it from Petersburg to Richmond. And then when they started to build the bridge, part of the selling, well, they had to make 301 go all the way to the river, and Maryland had to reroute some roads to make what was then Route 3 became Route 301 and went down to the bridge. So both sides had to build roads that went to the bridge. And so in Virginia, like I said, they renumbered Route 2 to Bowling Green as 2/301. And then they took the road from Bowling Green to Office Hall in King George and worked on it. Now, part of the problem was the Potomac River, the Rappahannock River Bridge in Port Royal was not built until the early 30s. So there was a ferry there too. There wasn't a good connection going across that river either. But then when they did this in 1939 and 40, they redid and improved the road to Office Hall. And then they had to do the road from basically Office Hall to the bridge. And they didn't go through the courthouse and down where 206 Dolphin Road is now. And so a lot of that was new road. And 205 went to Colonial Beach, and so the people who commuted from Colonial Beach, there's some stories, a lot of them commuted by water because there was no road. They went from Colonial Beach to the base. I always tell people, you got to remember, this was during the Harry Byrd years, when they pay as you go build highways, which meant they didn't build any. As a lifelong Virginian, I've read about Harry. He's before my time. I didn't need his son. But so that the road was basically the road from where Wawa is down to the river was new road. There wasn't a road there, so a lot of that would have been dirt and gravel.
I thought she was kind of, shading the truth, but she wasn't.
No, in fact, when they came over, they came across, it was dirt road, they pulled into a dirt lot and turned around and went back when they did the opening ceremony for the bridge. Much like when they opened this new bridge, Governor Hogan basically pulled into the parking lot of their museum and turned around and went back.
Yeah.
Looking at the picture of the bridge, this reminds me, some of y'all aren't aware, is that one of the founders of the Historical Society did something interesting on the first day the bridge was dedicated. He flew a plane underneath the bridge.
Yeah, well, we had a forum, our Doggett Heritage Foundation had a forum with Walter Mason. It turned to be about 2 or 3 months before he died, so it was very lucky that we did it when we did it. But he told the story, he and Blue Burgess, who was his instructor, were going to fly to Fredericksburg to get some, they were working on cars, needed something, so they were going to fly to Fredericksburg. And they took off, and Blue flew under the bridge. He asked Walter Mason if he wanted to do it. So they turned around and went back, and he flew under the bridge. And I have a Baltimore Sun newspaper from a couple days after that makes a note of a small airplane flying under the bridge. And the governor of Maryland was there, and some other Maryland dignitaries. The governor of Virginia was not there. I don't know if he was invited and chose not to come, but Virginia was not represented. You can tell I like this stuff. Got a whole bunch of stuff up here. Well, thanks.
So with the steamboats, when they first started in the 1820s and 30s, I understand that there was plenty of wharves.
Yeah, all up and down the river. They were on both Rappahannock and the Potomac, and they made a lot of deliveries. I mean, I had pictures of a showboat in Port Conway in the 30s or sometime like that. I mean, so yeah, there were a lot of stops. I mean, you could pull into the creeks down Northern Neck, something like that. There were a lot of places where they pulled in and delivered stuff and picked up passengers. Almost like a local.
And that would be any corner produce, cattle, and stuff like
Yeah,
that.
and like I said, they would bring things from. They brought people would buy stuff and then bring it from Baltimore, places like that.
I actually what's the former Parker store. Now the old Index store at Salem Church in Route 3. It's called the Macy's of Northern Neck because they could order stuff out of Baltimore and have it delivered the next week. Anything from car to farm equipment to dresses, hats, anything.
Yep. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much.